Welcome to Night Crime Stories. Tonight, we examine the case of Fred and Rose West, a seemingly ordinary couple who turned 25, Cromwell Street into a charnel house of unimaginable secrets. Beneath the floors, behind the walls, the truth lay buried for decades. Settle in, turn off the lights, and let the case unfold. Opening meditation. There is a particular kind of darkness that lives inside a digital file. Not the darkness of a poorly lit photograph, or the shadow that falls across a face in a crowded room. This is something different. This is the darkness of intent. The darkness of a decision made in a private space, behind a closed door, by someone who believed, fully and completely, that they would never be found. Tonight, we sit with a case that began in the cold language of a federal database. A case that was, for a long time, just a number. Just a designation. A bureaucratic placeholder for a human being whose identity remained stubbornly, frustratingly, dangerously unknown. FBI John Doe 47. Those 4 words, that number, represented something that kept investigators awake at night. Something that drew thousands of ordinary people online, people armed with nothing more than curiosity and a browser window, to pore over images, to study backgrounds, to analyze shower curtains and bathroom tiles and the faint geometry of a reflected surface, all in search of a single answer. Who is this person? And perhaps more urgently, where are they now? And who have they hurt? Tonight, we trace the full arc of that search. We follow the federal investigators, the online communities, the submitted tips, and the quiet, persistent work of people who refuse to let a number remain just a number. This is the story of FBI John Doe 47. And tonight, for the first time, it ends. Part 1, the ECAP program and the language of unknown faces. To understand the case of FBI John Doe 47, you first have to understand the world in which that designation was born. A world of federal databases, of forensic image analysis, of a particular kind of investigative work that most people never think about and almost nobody wants to think about. The FBI maintains a program called ECAP. The acronym stands for Endangered Child Alert Program. It was established as a direct response to a crisis that had been building quietly for decades and then exploded into something undeniable with the rise of the Internet, the proliferation of child sexual abuse material, distributed across digital networks, crossing state lines and international borders with a speed and ease that made traditional law enforcement approaches seem almost quaint by comparison. The ECAP program operates on a deceptively simple premise. When investigators recover images or video recordings in the course of their work, material depicting the sexual abuse or exploitation of children, they analyze that material with extraordinary care. They look not just at the central subjects of the images, but at everything surrounding them. Backgrounds. Objects. Architectural details. Clothing. Skin markings. The grain of a wooden floor. The pattern on a set of curtains. The particular way light falls through a window at a certain time of day. What they are looking for, always, is identity. The identity of the person behind the camera. The person who created the material. The person who, in the commission of creating that material, left traces of themselves embedded in every frame. Because here is the thing about photographs and videos that many people who create them fail to fully appreciate. You cannot take a picture of someone else without also, in some subtle way, taking a picture of yourself. Your environment reveals you. Your habits reveal you. The objects you surround yourself with, the spaces you inhabit, the small unconscious choices you make about how and where and when you create a recording, all of these things speak. All of these things have something to say about who you are and where you might be found. The investigators who work within the ECAP program have learned to listen to those things with extraordinary patience and care. And when they identify a subject they cannot place, a face, a partial figure, a set of hands, a background that offers clues without offering answers, they create what they call an unknown individual profile. These profiles are published publicly. The FBI releases them, carefully redacted to protect the identities of victims and to preserve the integrity of ongoing investigations, and they ask the public a simple question. Do you recognize this person? Have you seen this background? Have you noticed something that might tell us who this is and where they might be? It is, in its way, a remarkable act of institutional humility. The most powerful law enforcement agency in the United States, reaching out to the public and saying, "We need your help." By the time John Doe 47 was added to the ECAP database and made public, dozens of such profiles existed. Some had been resolved. Tips had come in from neighbors, from co-workers, from family members who had looked at a redacted photograph and recognized something, a tattoo, a gesture, a distinctive piece of furniture, and made the difficult, courageous decision to pick up the phone. Others remained unresolved. Names without faces. Numbers without answers. John Doe 47 fell, for a long and troubling time, into that second category. The FBI's profile of John Doe 47 was sparse in the way that all such profiles must necessarily be. It contained carefully selected images and video captures. It contained a physical description, an individual appearing to be between the ages of approximately 18 and 25 at the time the material was believed to have been created. It contained a probable timeframe for the creation of the material, footage and imagery that investigators assessed to have been produced in or around April of the year 2020. April 2020. Let that date settle for a moment. The world in April 2020 was a strange and frightened place. A global pandemic had shuttered businesses, emptied streets, locked people inside their homes. Hundreds of millions of people around the world were isolated in ways they had never been before, cut off from their routines, their social structures, their ordinary patterns of movement and interaction. Schools were closed. Offices were closed. The ordinary architecture of daily life had been suspended, perhaps indefinitely, and nobody quite knew when or whether it would return. For children and young people living in unsafe home environments, the consequences of that lockdown were devastating in ways that only emerged slowly in the data, in the case files, in the grim statistics that researchers began to publish as the months wore on and the scale of what had happened during those lockdown weeks and months became clear. Child Protection Services reported dramatic drops in referrals during the early months of the pandemic. Not because abuse had decreased, but because the mechanisms by which abuse was reported, teachers observing children in classrooms, school counselors having private conversations, neighbors noticing unusual patterns of behavior, had been removed. The watchers had been sent home. The safe spaces had been closed. And so children who were already in dangerous situations found themselves suddenly more isolated. More cut off from the adults who might have intervened. More alone with the people who wished to harm them. The timing of John Doe 47's material, April 2020, places it squarely in that dark season. In the heart of that particular vulnerability. Whether the pandemic contributed to the circumstances in which that material was created, whether it provided cover or opportunity or simply coincidence, is something that only the full investigation would eventually be able to address. What matters, in the beginning, is the date. And the face. And the number. John Doe 47. An unknown individual with a known crime. A face without a name. A number waiting for an answer. Part 2, the images themselves, what the footage revealed. In the case of John Doe 47, the material that investigators were working from had been analyzed with precisely that kind of care. The images and video captures that were eventually released to the public had been prepared by specialists. Frames were selected. Certain details were emphasized. Others were obscured. The goal was always the same, to maximize the probability that someone, somewhere, would look at what was being shown and recognize something. What the released imagery showed, in the carefully curated form in which the public saw it, was this. An individual. A person whose age, based on the assessment of forensic specialists and medical experts who review such materials as part of the ECAP process, appeared to fall somewhere in the range of 18 to 25 years. This is not an insignificant detail. The FBI's assessment of age in such cases is based on rigorous analysis, physical development, skin characteristics, the subtle physiological markers that forensic specialists learn to read and interpret. The conclusion that the individual appeared to be in the late adolescent to young adult range was, by all accounts, a considered professional judgment. The physical appearance visible in the released images offered limited but potentially significant details. Investigators noted features that might be recognizable to someone who knew this person, someone who had perhaps attended school with them, or worked alongside them, or lived in the same neighborhood, or simply seen them in passing often enough to retain a visual impression. But it was not the face alone that investigators and online sleuths would spend months analyzing. It was the environment. The background. The details that most people would look at without seeing. The bathroom. Much of the material in this case appeared to have been created in a domestic bathroom setting. This is not unusual in ECAP cases. Bathrooms are private spaces, they offer a degree of sound insulation, they provide a surface, a mirror, that can be used in various ways during the creation of recorded material. For investigators, bathrooms are also, somewhat paradoxically, among the more information-rich environments that appear in this kind of case. Because bathrooms have distinctive signatures. The color and pattern of tiles. The style and age of fixtures. The shape and size of a bathtub or shower enclosure. The particular grout lines between tiles that can, in some cases, be matched to a specific installation. The brand and model of a showerhead, visible in a single frame. The distinctive pattern of a shower curtain that might have been purchased at a particular retailer during a particular period, narrowing down not just a geographical region but a specific window of time. These details, the architectural forensics of a domestic bathroom, became one of the primary focuses of the investigators working this case. And they became, as we will see, an obsession for the online communities that rallied around it. The shower curtain visible in the John Doe 47 material became something of a central object in the public investigation. Online sleuths in communities dedicated to solving exactly this kind of case, forums and subreddits where ordinary people with research skills and methodical minds volunteer their time to assist with publicly released investigative materials, spent considerable effort trying to identify the curtain's manufacturer, its retail origin, and the geographical distribution of its sales. This kind of reverse product investigation sounds almost mundane when described in plain terms. But in practice, it represents something quite extraordinary. It represents a democratization of forensic investigation. Ordinary people, a retired librarian in one state, a college student in another, a middle-aged man who works in retail and has an encyclopedic knowledge of home goods, bringing their specific, unlikely expertise to bear on a problem that trained federal investigators were also working. The subreddit communities most deeply involved in this work, including spaces dedicated specifically to unresolved mysteries and to the tracing of objects and backgrounds in investigative imagery, developed their own methodologies. Members would collect screenshots, create side-by-side comparisons, research product histories, cross-reference regional sales data, post their findings for others to scrutinize and build upon. In the case of John Doe 47, this effort was sustained over a considerable period. Months. In some threads, years. Members came and went. Theories were proposed and discarded. Leads were followed and lost. The shower curtain remained, for a long time, stubbornly unidentified. The background details gave up their secrets only slowly, and sometimes not at all. What sustained these communities, what kept people returning to a case long after the initial excitement had faded, was something that is difficult to articulate but easy to feel. The sense that there was a real person behind the number. That John Doe 47 was out there, somewhere, with a name and an address and a life being lived in apparent impunity. And that somewhere, also, was a victim, or possibly more than one, whose experience of harm had not yet been answered by justice. That sense of unfinished moral business. That refusal to accept that the number would always remain just a number. That is what kept people searching. Part 3, The World of Online Sleuthing, Communities, Methods, and Moral Weight. Before we go further into the specific details of how this case was eventually resolved, it is worth pausing to understand the world that grew up around it. The world of online investigative communities. The people who populate those spaces. What drives them? What methods they use? And what they are, and are not, equipped to accomplish. The phenomenon of amateur online investigation is not new. Long before the Internet, ordinary citizens contributed to law enforcement through tip lines, through the reporting of suspicious behavior, through the kind of community-based observation and communication that has always been one of the most reliable sources of investigative intelligence. The idea that civilians have a role to play in the pursuit of justice is embedded in the foundations of how democratic societies approach law enforcement. What changed with the Internet was scale, speed, and organization. Communities that might previously have existed as scattered individuals, each with their own knowledge, their own skills, their own private suspicions, could now find each other. Could compare notes. Could build collective knowledge bases of extraordinary depth and breadth. The subreddit r/unresolved mysteries is one of the larger and more well-known of these communities. Founded in the early years of Reddit's existence, it grew into a space where thousands of members discuss cases ranging from historical cold cases to newly emerged missing persons situations to exactly the kind of ECAP-adjacent investigations that John Doe 47 represents. The community has its own culture, its own norms, a generally serious, research-focused orientation that distinguishes it from more sensationalist spaces. Members are encouraged to cite sources, to be cautious about speculation, to draw a clear distinction between what the evidence shows and what is merely hypothesized. The moderators enforce standards designed to keep the community focused on constructive investigation rather than the kind of mob-oriented speculation that has, in some higher-profile cases, caused genuine harm to innocent people. The companion community r/Trace Object is more specialized. It exists, essentially, as a forensic product identification service staffed entirely by volunteers. Members submit images of objects, a piece of clothing, a piece of furniture, a background detail in a photograph, and other members attempt to identify them. It draws on people with professional backgrounds in retail, manufacturing, design, and distribution, as well as ordinary enthusiasts who have simply developed extensive knowledge of consumer products through years of casual research. Together, these communities represent something genuinely significant in the landscape of modern criminal investigation. They are not, and they do not claim to be, law enforcement agencies. They have no authority to compel cooperation, no access to sealed databases, no legal mechanisms for pursuing leads that require official action. What they have is numbers, collective knowledge, and a remarkable amount of time. Other members focused on the architectural details of the bathroom itself. The style of the fixtures suggested a particular era of installation, not necessarily the era in which the footage was created, but the era in which the bathroom had been fitted. This kind of detail can help narrow a geographic region, since construction and renovation trends vary by location and by economic context. A bathroom fitted with fixtures that were common in a particular region during a particular decade tells you something, perhaps not much, but something, about where that bathroom might be. Still other members focused on details of the individual themselves. Not in ways that could be directly used to identify them, the FBI's released imagery was carefully controlled in terms of what identifying information it revealed, but in terms of what those visible details suggested about lifestyle, about socioeconomic context, about the kind of environment in which this person might move. None of it, for a long time, led to an identification. The case remained open. The number remained just a number. But the communities didn't give up. They continued to revisit the case, periodically. New members with fresh eyes would join threads that had been dormant for months and offer perspectives that hadn't been considered before. Existing members would compare the John Doe 47 details against newly released material from other cases, looking for overlaps or connections that might provide a different angle of approach. This persistent, collective, voluntary effort represents something that deserves to be recognized and honored. These are people who give their time, who expose themselves to disturbing material, who carry the weight of that exposure for no compensation and no official recognition, because they believe that justice for victims matters. Because they believe that unknown individuals should not remain unknown indefinitely. Because they believe that numbers should have names. And eventually, in the case of John Doe 47, the system worked. Not through the subreddit threads alone, the ultimate identification came through the official tip line, through the formal mechanism the FBI had established for exactly that purpose. But the communities that kept the case alive, that kept the profile circulating, that continued to share and discuss and analyze, those communities were part of the infrastructure that made the eventual tip possible. Someone, somewhere, saw the profile at just the right moment. Recognized something. And made the call. Part 4, The Geography of a Case, Where and When. In any investigation involving recorded material, geography matters enormously. The question of where something was created, what state, what city, what neighborhood, what specific building, is often the single most important question investigators are trying to answer. Because geography leads to records. Records lead to names. Names lead to people. The specifics of what investigators were able to determine about the location of the John Doe 47 material have not been fully disclosed publicly. This is standard practice in active and recently resolved cases. The details of investigative methodology are protected both to preserve the integrity of any prosecution that might follow and to prevent future perpetrators from learning exactly what details give them away. What we can discuss is the general framework of how geographical determination works in image analysis investigations. The first and most fundamental tool is metadata. Digital images and video files contain metadata, embedded information about when and how they were created. This can include, in some cases, GPS coordinates derived from a device's location services at the time of recording. It can include the specific make and model of the recording device, which can then be traced through sales records. It can include timestamps that, when cross-referenced with other known data points, help establish a timeline. The second major tool is what might be called environmental forensics, the analysis of visible physical details in the recorded environment that carry geographical significance. Products are the most obvious example. Consumer goods are manufactured and distributed according to patterns that vary by region and by time period. A shower curtain available only through a particular regional retail chain narrows the field. A specific brand of cleaning product visible on a bathroom shelf might be manufactured and distributed primarily in a particular part of the country. A window glimpsed in the background might reveal a type of architecture characteristic of a specific climate zone. None of these details are individually conclusive. A person can buy a regionally specific product while visiting a different region. An architect from one part of the country can build a house that looks like it belongs somewhere else. The absence of certainty in any single detail is exactly why this kind of analysis requires accumulation, the gradual building of a case from many small clues, each of which points in a direction, the totality of which begins to point somewhere specific. In the John Doe 47 case, online communities spent considerable time attempting exactly this kind of accumulation. Thread after thread in the relevant subreddits addressed questions of geography. Where might this bathroom be located? What does the architectural style suggest about the region? What do the visible products suggest about the retail environment? What does the quality and character of the light visible in the footage suggest about the latitude and the season? The temporal detail, April 2020, is significant here as well. The FBI's assessment that the material was created in or around April of 2020 was not simply an inference from the content of the footage. It was based on forensic analysis of the digital file itself, combined potentially with contextual clues within the material. This dating has implications for the geographical investigation, because conditions in April 2020 varied significantly by region, the pandemic's trajectory, the specific lockdown measures in place, the weather, all of which could in theory be cross-referenced against what was visible in the footage. The convergence of these analytical threads, federal investigators working with their full institutional resources, online communities working with their collective civilian knowledge, and the possibility always present that someone with direct personal knowledge of the individual might recognize something in the released material, is what ultimately drives resolution in cases of this kind. The case of John Doe 47 resisted resolution for a significant period. The investigation remained open. The profile remained live on the ECAP page. The online communities continued to revisit it, continued to circulate it, continued to ask the same fundamental question. Who is this person? Where are they? When will they be found? Human. A human being who knew something, or recognized something, and made the decision to act on that knowledge. Part 5, The Psychological Profile, Understanding the Type. One of the most important, and most carefully considered, aspects of any investigation into crimes of this kind is the attempt to construct a psychological profile of the unknown subject. This is not a precise science. Forensic psychology applied to the investigation of unknown offenders is a discipline built on probabilities and patterns rather than certainties. But it is a discipline that has, over decades of practice and refinement, developed genuine predictive value. In the case of John Doe 47, the available information for constructing even a basic psychological profile was limited by the same constraints that limited the physical identification effort. The material available to investigators and to the public was carefully curated. Much of what investigators knew about the behavioral patterns implied by the material was not publicly disclosed. But we can speak in general terms about the psychological profile typical of individuals who create and, in many such cases, distribute material of this kind. We can speak about what the research tells us, what the patterns reveal, and what those patterns suggest about how and where such individuals live and move in the world. The most important thing to understand about individuals who produce material of this kind is that they almost invariably present as entirely ordinary in their external social lives. This is not a cliché. It is a pattern so consistent across documented cases that it approaches a clinical axiom. The person who creates such material is typically, to the people who know them casually, neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances, an unremarkable human being. Quiet, perhaps. Pleasant enough. Not obviously troubled. Not someone who would draw attention to themselves. This capacity for ordinary presentation is not accidental. It is, in many cases, actively cultivated. The individual learns, often from a very young age, that the interior landscape of their compulsions and desires is socially catastrophic, legally criminal, and profoundly dangerous to expose. They develop, in response, a kind of double architecture. An outer face, functional, sociable, adaptive, and an inner world kept entirely separate. The creation of recorded material is, in the psychological framework developed by researchers who study this phenomenon, a form of documentation. It serves several functions simultaneously. It validates the experience of the perpetrator, it makes the event feel more real, more permanent, more fully possessed. It can be used as currency in criminal networks where such material is traded or sold. And it serves as a form of what some researchers have called trophy behavior, the maintenance of a record that the individual can return to and use. The decision to record carries with it, inevitably, the risk of exposure. This risk is not unknown to perpetrators. Most individuals who create material of this kind are aware, at least intellectually, that recording increases their vulnerability. But the psychological literature consistently suggests that this awareness does not function as an effective deterrent. The impulse to record is powerful enough, and the individual's belief in their own ability to avoid detection is inflated enough, that the risk calculus almost never comes down on the side of restraint. This inflated belief in one's own ability to avoid detection, a kind of operational overconfidence, is itself a psychological signature. It is associated with certain patterns of behavior that, paradoxically, increase rather than decrease the probability of eventual detection. Individuals who believe they are genuinely untouchable become careless in ways that individuals who more accurately assess their risk do not. They leave backgrounds uncontrolled. They use devices that retain metadata. They access distribution networks without adequate protective measures. They underestimate the analytical capabilities of investigators and the encyclopedic collective knowledge of online communities. They believe that ordinary-looking objects, a shower curtain, a tile pattern, the particular shadow of light through a frosted window, are too generic to be traced. They are wrong. But somewhere out there, someone saw the profile and recognized something. Perhaps it was a gesture, a posture, something in the way the individual held themselves that was recognizable to someone who knew them. Perhaps it was a visible detail of the environment, something that the online communities had not been able to identify but that was immediately and specifically recognizable to someone with direct knowledge of that space. Perhaps it was simply the face. Perhaps, despite the care with which the imagery had been prepared for public release, there was enough there that someone who knew this person could not unsee what they were looking at. Whatever it was that triggered the tip, someone made the call. And the investigation moved forward. Part 6, The investigation deepens, methods and machinery. Some tips in cases like this are genuinely credible, submitted by people with direct knowledge, specific and verifiable details, a clear connection to the case. Others are submitted in good faith but are based on mistaken identification, a person who genuinely believes they recognize the subject but is responding to superficial similarity rather than actual identity. And a small number, in cases that attract public attention, are submitted by individuals with their own agendas, attempting to implicate someone they have a personal conflict with, or seeking the attention that comes from being associated with a high-profile case. The investigative machinery that evaluates tips is designed to sort these categories efficiently. Experienced agents review incoming submissions. They look for specific, verifiable details that could only be known to someone with genuine knowledge of the case. They look for internal consistency. Does the information hold together when examined from multiple angles? They look for corroboration. Can any element of what the tip contains be independently verified against what investigators already know? A tip that passes this initial evaluation is not yet the basis for action. It is the beginning of a more intensive investigative thread. Investigators will begin developing additional information around the named or described subject. They will look at publicly available records, social media, property records, business registrations, court records, anything that might provide independent confirmation or contradiction of what the tip contains. In the modern investigative environment, social media is often one of the first resources investigators turn to in developing a potential identification. This is not because social media is a reliable source of truth, it manifestly is not, but because it is a rich source of contextual information. A person's social media history can reveal, or at least suggest, where they live, where they work, who they associate with, what their daily patterns look like, and crucially, what their physical environment looks like. Photographs posted online contain backgrounds. Those backgrounds can be compared against the backgrounds visible in material recovered in an investigation. When backgrounds match, when the same distinctive tile pattern, the same recognizable curtain, the same architectural feature appears in both a law enforcement evidence file and a social media post, that correspondence begins to constitute evidence. This process of background matching between investigative materials and public social media content is one of the tools that has become increasingly important in cases of this kind. It requires careful analytical work and significant caution. Mistaken matches can lead investigations in wrong directions, and the stakes of getting it wrong are substantial. But when a match is genuine and verifiable, it can be extraordinarily powerful. This full apparatus of federal investigative resources was, by all accounts, applied to the case of John Doe 47. The investigation had been active since the material was recovered and the profile created. The public ECAP listing was one component of a much broader investigative effort, the public component, the visible tip of a much larger institutional process that was ongoing throughout the period when the case appeared to be stalled. The appearance of a stalled case and the reality of a stalled investigation are not always the same thing. Cases that appear, from the outside, to have gone cold are sometimes being actively developed in ways that cannot be publicly discussed without jeopardizing the investigation. The continued presence of John Doe 47's profile on the ECAP page, unchanged and apparently unresolved, did not necessarily mean that the underlying investigation had made no progress. What it meant was that the public component, the call for tips, the request for identification from anyone who might recognize the subject, was still active. Still useful. Still potentially the thread that, when pulled, would unravel the whole protective fiction of anonymity that the unknown subject had constructed around themselves. And then it was pulled. Part 7, The Tip That Changed Everything. The moment that turns an unresolved case into a closed one is often, from the outside, invisible. There is no announcement. No press conference. No sudden shift in the publicly available information. The change happens in an investigative office somewhere, as a tip is processed and evaluated and found to contain something that previous tips did not, something specific enough, verifiable enough, compelling enough to move the case to a new phase. What has been publicly confirmed in the most definitive way possible, through the update to the ECAP page and the subsequent public announcement of the case's resolution, is that the identification was made. John Doe 47 was identified. The unknown individual received a name. The number resolved into a specific human being with a specific history and a specific location. And critically, the individual was captured. That word. Captured. It carries weight. It carries the full accumulated weight of the investigation, the months or years of analysis, the sustained effort of online communities, the work of federal investigators, the courage of the tipster, compressed into a single moment of apprehension. The process of apprehension in cases of this kind follows a carefully structured protocol. When investigators have developed sufficient evidence to support an arrest, they do not act immediately and unilaterally. They consult with prosecutors. They review the evidentiary basis for the arrest against the legal standards that must be met. They coordinate with local law enforcement in the jurisdiction where the subject is located, if that is different from the jurisdiction in which the investigation is being conducted. They also think carefully about operational security, about how to execute the arrest in a way that minimizes the risk that the subject will become aware of what is coming and attempt to destroy evidence or flee. This concern is not theoretical. In cases involving digital evidence, the risk that a subject who suspects imminent arrest will attempt to destroy devices, wipe data, or simply leave the jurisdiction is significant enough that investigators plan around it carefully. The timing of an arrest in this kind of case is calibrated to maximize the preservation of evidence. Often, arrests are coordinated with simultaneous searches, the person taken into custody while other agents execute search warrants at relevant locations, securing devices and physical evidence before the subject or anyone connected to them has the opportunity to interfere. The response in those communities was, by all accounts, one of profound relief. Not celebration in a triumphalist sense. The resolution of a case like this does not undo the harm that was done, does not eliminate the experience of the person or people who were victimized, does not make what happened not have happened. But there was relief. The recognition that the persistent work of those communities, the months of thread posting, the object analysis, the continual circulation of the profile, had been part of the ecosystem that produced this outcome. Someone in the community that remembered and kept alive the story of John Doe 47 posted a simple acknowledgement. Something to the effect that this result was possible because people refused to stop paying attention. Because the profile was kept circulating. Because somewhere, at some point, it reached the right person. The original post that announced the resolution in r/unresolved mysteries carried a simple message, expressed with characteristic directness by the person who wrote it. Whoever submitted the tip and identified this monster deserves a huge applause. It is hard to argue with that sentiment. Part 8, The Victims, centering what matters most. In any investigation of this kind, it is possible, and it happens too often, for the narrative to become dominated by the investigation itself. The methodology. The detective work. The resolution of the procedural puzzle. These things are important. They matter. They deserve to be documented and understood. But they are not the most important thing. The most important thing is always the person who was harmed. The person, the child, the young person, who appears in the material that investigators are working from. The person whose experience of real harm initiated the entire investigative process. The person for whom justice, however imperfect and however delayed, is ultimately what this effort is in service of. In cases of this nature, we do not know the identity of the victim. The FBI does not release that information. The investigators do not release that information. The protection of victim identity in cases involving minors is absolute and non-negotiable, and it should be. What we can say is that there is a person, a real human being, whose experience of harm has been the central unspoken fact of every thread, every analysis, every submitted tip, every decision made by every person who engaged with this case. The impact of sexual exploitation, particularly exploitation that is recorded and potentially distributed, on its victims is the subject of an extensive and sobering body of research. The harm is not confined to the physical experience of the abuse itself. It extends through time. It takes forms that are difficult to quantify but devastating to live with. Victims of recorded exploitation often describe a particular kind of ongoing violation that is distinct from other forms of abuse. The knowledge that the material exists, that the most intimate and traumatic moments of their experience have been captured, fixed, made permanent, and potentially distributed to people they will never meet and cannot identify, creates a form of harm that does not end when the abuse ends. It persists. It follows the person through their life. Every news story about a case, every public profile release, every investigation that touches on material involving them, carries the potential to reopen something that they have been working to close. Organizations that support survivors of recorded exploitation speak about this with great clarity and great urgency. They describe what they call the second wound, the ongoing psychological injury of knowing that the documentation of one's victimization is out there, accessible, potentially being viewed at any moment by any number of unknown people. The loss of control over one's own image, one's own story, one's own most vulnerable moments. The capture of the person identified as John Doe 47 does not eliminate the material that was created. It does not unsend what was sent. It does not unview what was viewed. The legal process that follows an arrest, the prosecution, the potential conviction, the potential sentence, does something important in terms of accountability and deterrence. But for the victim, justice in the criminal sense is only one dimension of what recovery requires. Resources exist for survivors of exploitation involving recorded material. Organizations operate specifically to help individuals navigate the impossible task of pursuing removal of material from online platforms, of rebuilding a sense of agency and safety and self-determination, of finding community with others who understand from the inside what it means to carry that particular weight. These resources are not sufficient. They are not funded adequately. They do not reach everyone who needs them. But they exist, and their existence represents an acknowledgement that the harm done to victims of recorded exploitation extends far beyond the initial crime and requires a sustained, specialized, compassionate response. The person or persons at the center of this case, the person or people visible in the material that led to the creation of the John Doe 47 profile, deserve that response. They deserve the sustained attention of investigators. They deserve the persistent concern of the online communities that kept the case alive. They deserve the courage of the tipster who made the call that moved everything forward. And they deserve whatever measure of peace becomes possible now that the person who harmed them has been identified, captured, and faces the accountability of the legal system. Part 9, The Legal Framework, What Happens After Capture. The capture of John Doe 47 is not the end of the story. It is the end of a particular chapter, the chapter of the unknown individual, the open profile, the unanswered question. But the story continues into the legal process, and that process deserves to be understood. The federal legal framework for cases involving child sexual abuse material, the production, distribution, and possession of such material, is among the most serious in the American Criminal Code. The statutes that govern this area of law reflect a considered legislative judgment that crimes of this kind represent one of the gravest categories of offense against human dignity and well-being. The production of child sexual abuse material, the actual creation of such material, carries the most severe penalties under federal law. Mandatory minimum sentences for production offenses typically begin at 15 years of incarceration. Maximum sentences can extend to 30 years for a first offense. In cases involving aggravating factors, multiple victims, victims of particular vulnerability, abuse of a position of trust, distribution of the material, sentences can be substantially longer. In cases where the offense involves victims below a certain age, mandatory minimums increase further. The distribution of such material, the sharing, selling, or transmission of it across networks, which is how such material typically comes to the attention of federal investigators, carries its own set of serious penalties. Federal law does not distinguish between distribution for profit and distribution without financial compensation in terms of the seriousness with which the offense is treated. The harm done to victims by the distribution of material depicting their abuse is not mitigated by the absence of a commercial transaction. In a case like John Doe 47, where the individual has been publicly identified through a federal program and subsequently captured, the prosecutorial process begins with the initial appearance and the charges being formally filed. The defendant will be presented before a federal magistrate or judge. Bail conditions will be assessed. In cases of this kind, pretrial detention is the norm, given the severity of the charges and the risk factors that courts consider in such situations. The formal indictment or information will detail the specific charges. The resolution of federal cases of this kind, statistically, tends to come through plea agreements rather than trials. The evidence in digital exploitation cases, when it is well developed, is often substantial enough that proceeding to trial represents a significant strategic risk for the defense. Plea agreements allow prosecutors to secure certain outcomes without requiring victims to testify or be otherwise involved in proceedings that could compound their trauma. Whatever specific legal path the case of the individual identified as John Doe 47 follows, the capture represents the crossing of a threshold that many such cases never reach. The transition from an unknown individual, a number, a profile, a face without a name, to a named defendant standing before a court and facing the full weight of federal law. That transition matters. It matters to investigators. It matters to the communities that kept the case alive. And it matters, most of all, to the person who was harmed. Part 10, The Broader Context, ECAP and the Scale of the Problem. The resolution of the John Doe 47 case is a meaningful achievement. It deserves to be recognized as such. But it also deserves to be understood in context, in the context of the broader landscape of child exploitation investigation, which is vast and complex and in many respects deeply troubling in what it reveals about the scale of harm being done to children in digital environments. The FBI's ECAP program, as of the time this case was resolved, maintained an active list of unknown individuals whose profiles remained open. The original post that announced the resolution of John Doe 47 on r/unresolved mysteries made note of this explicitly. there are still more cases on the page. More unknown individuals. More profiles waiting for the tip that will resolve them. This is the reality of the investigative environment. Individual case resolutions are important and meaningful. But they exist against a backdrop of a problem whose scale is staggering. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, operates the Cyber Tipline, a mechanism through which electronic service providers are required by law to report known instances of child sexual abuse material. The numbers reported through this system have increased dramatically over the past decade. In the tens of millions annually. Not unique images or videos, many reports involve the same material being detected on multiple platforms. But the sheer volume of the reporting gives some indication of the scope of what investigators are dealing with. The investigative resources devoted to this problem, at the federal level, at the state and local level, and through international cooperation with law enforcement agencies in other countries, are substantial. They are also, by any honest assessment, insufficient to the scale of what they are attempting to address. Investigators and prosecutors in this area work under conditions of chronic resource strain, managing caseloads that are in many instances simply not humanly manageable if every case is to receive the attention it deserves. The communities that developed around ECAP-adjacent cases, focus specifically on material that the FBI itself has released for public investigation, with clear protocols established by the federal agency about what is being sought, operate in a somewhat different context. They are working in direct partnership with the official investigative process, responding to a specific public request for identification assistance. The guardrails are clearer. The focus is more disciplined. That discipline, maintained over years in the case of John Doe 47, contributed to the outcome. The case remained in circulation. The profile continued to be shared. The question of who this person was continued to be asked by people who cared about the answer. And the answer came. Part 11. What resolution looks like, and what it doesn't. There is a temptation, when a case like this is resolved, to experience the resolution as a kind of completion. A story with a proper ending. The unknown identified, the captured individual now in custody, the machinery of justice engaged and moving toward its conclusion. But resolution in cases of this kind is more complicated than that. It is necessary and important and worth celebrating in the way that meaningful human effort achieving its goal is worth celebrating. And it is also, in a very real sense, not the end of anything. For the investigators who worked this case, resolution does not mean rest. It means a transition to the next phase, the development of the prosecution, the coordination with victim services, the parallel investigation of any additional victims or connected cases that the identification might open up. And it means returning to the remaining open profiles on the ECAP page, the remaining numbers waiting for names, and starting the process again. For the online communities, resolution means something slightly different. It means acknowledgement that the sustained attention of concerned civilians can matter. That the work of keeping a case visible, of continuing to circulate a profile, of returning to threads that have gone quiet and asking the question again, this work has value. Real investigative value. The resolution of John Doe 47 will be cited, in those communities, as evidence that the effort is worth making. That cases should not be allowed to fade simply because they have been open for a long time. For the victim, for the person at the center of this case, whose identity we do not know and will not speculate about, resolution means something that none of us outside that person's experience can fully understand. It may mean relief. It may mean anger, the anger of having had to wait so long, of having had to know, for however many months or years, that the person who harmed them was unidentified and free. It may mean fear, fear of exposure, fear of what the legal process might require of them, fear of what the publicity around the case might mean for their privacy and their healing. It almost certainly means something complicated that does not resolve neatly into a single emotion. The support systems available to survivors in situations like this are, as we have noted, insufficient to the scale of need. But they exist. And the resolution of the case, the capture of the individual responsible, is a necessary precondition for the kind of official recognition and support that comes through the legal process, including victim services coordinated through the prosecution. For the person who submitted the tip that led to the identification, and whoever that person is, whatever their relationship to the subject or the case, whatever motivated them to make the call they made, resolution likely carries its own complicated weight. The decision to report someone, to provide information that will result in arrest and prosecution, is never a simple one, regardless of how clear the moral case for it might be. It may involve the disruption of relationships, the exposure of one's own knowledge of something disturbing, the experience of being drawn into a legal process. The courage required to make that call should not be underestimated. The post on r/unresolved mysteries got this exactly right. Whoever submitted the tip and identified this monster deserves a huge applause. Not a perfunctory applause. Not a pro forma acknowledgement. A genuine recognition that this person did something difficult and necessary and right. That they saw something, and they acted on it, when acting on it was not easy. That act, the act of coming forward, is the hinge on which this entire resolution turned. Part 12, the ongoing work, lessons, legacies, and lives still to be protected. The case of FBI John Doe 47 is closed. The unknown individual has a name. The capture has been made. The number has resolved into an answer. But the work continues. It continues in the cases that remain open on the ECAP page, the remaining unknown individuals whose profiles are still live, still waiting, still asking the same fundamental question of anyone who will look at them. It continues in the investigative offices where agents are processing new material, identifying new cases, creating new profiles for individuals who believe themselves to be anonymous and permanent. It continues in the online communities where people are, right now, examining released imagery, comparing products, analyzing backgrounds, circulating profiles that have not yet found their resolution. The work continues in the policy debates about how online platforms handle material of this kind, debates about reporting requirements, about detection technology, about the responsibilities of companies that operate the networks across which such material is distributed. It continues in the funding arguments for victim services organizations, for Internet crimes against children task forces, for the investigative units that bear the daily weight of this work. It continues in the classrooms where children are, or should be, taught to recognize unsafe situations, to trust their own perceptions, to know that there are adults who will listen and believe them and act. It continues in the homes where parents have difficult conversations about what their children may encounter online, about what it means to be safe and what it means to be unsafe, about what the internet is and what it can do and how it can be used against them by people who wish them harm. None of this work is complete. None of it is simple. None of it is adequately resourced or adequately understood by the general public. But what the case of John Doe 47 demonstrates, what its resolution, after a long period of apparent stagnation, demonstrates, is that the system works. Not perfectly. Not quickly enough. Not without the sustained effort of dedicated professionals and motivated civilians and courageous individuals willing to make difficult phone calls. But it works. The online communities that engaged with this case for months and years, that kept the profile circulating, that kept the question alive, that maintained the collective moral commitment to not allowing the case to quietly fade, are evidence of something else. They are evidence that the public's engagement with questions of justice is not merely passive or voyeuristic. That it can be active, methodical, sustained, and consequential. There is a temptation to characterize online engagement with cases like this as a form of entertainment, true crime consumption dressed up as civic participation. That characterization, while not entirely without foundation in some corners of internet culture, does not apply here. The communities that worked this case were not doing it for entertainment. They were doing it because a child had been harmed, because the person responsible was unknown, and because they believed, rightly, as it turned out, that their sustained attention might make a difference. It made a difference. The original post announcing the resolution of the case ended with a forward-looking note. There are still more cases on the page. More unknown individuals. More profiles waiting. The poster expressed hope that those cases too would find resolution, that more would be identified, that more years of open cases would come to a close. That hope is the appropriate note on which to understand this case. Not a triumphalism that ignores the scale of what remains undone. Not a despair that discounts the significance of what has been achieved. But a clear-eyed, forward-facing, sustained commitment to continuing the work. John Doe 47 is a number no more. The individual behind that designation has been identified. Has been captured. Is now facing the legal accountability that the crimes described in the federal profile demand. That is not nothing. In a landscape where so much remains unresolved, where so many cases carry numbers that have never received names, where so many victims wait for acknowledgement that what was done to them has not been forgotten and will not be permitted to pass without consequence, in that landscape, a single resolved case matters. It matters enormously. It matters as proof of concept. As evidence that the system, when it works, works because of people, investigators who dedicate their careers to this, civilians who dedicate their evenings, strangers who make difficult phone calls, victims who trust enough to participate in processes that can be deeply re-traumatizing, and everyone in between. It matters as a reminder that behind every federal case number, behind every designation like John Doe 47, is a real human story. A real harm. A real person waiting for justice. And behind the investigation that pursues that justice is also a collection of real human beings, driven by professional dedication, by civic concern, by the irreducible moral conviction that harm done to children cannot be allowed to simply disappear into the fog of anonymity. The case of FBI John Doe 47 is closed. But the work continues. And that is exactly as it should be. Closing meditation. There are moments, in following a case like this, when the sheer weight of what human beings are capable of doing to one another becomes almost unbearable. When the darkness that lives inside a digital file seems to say something irredeemably grim about the species that created the file and the networks that carried it and the systems that struggled for so long to address it. But there is another thing that this case says. A quieter thing. A thing that requires more attention to hear. It says that there are people who do not look away. Who see something difficult and keep looking until they understand it well enough to act on what they know. Investigators who carry the weight of this work every day, who process what most of us never have to imagine, and who return the next morning and do it again. Civilians who spend their evenings in online communities, studying the geometry of bathroom tiles and the origin of shower curtains, because they cannot reconcile themselves to the idea of a number remaining just a number. And someone, somewhere, at some point, who saw a federal profile and recognized something. Who made a call that they might have found easy not to make. Who chose to be part of the answer rather than part of the silence. The case of John Doe 47 is a story about darkness. But it is also, in the end, a story about people who refuse to let the darkness be the last word. If you have information about any of the remaining cases on the FBI's ACAP page, you can submit a tip at tips.fbi.gov. The work continues. The profiles remain active. The calls are still waiting to be made. Rest well tonight. Hold close the knowledge that there are people in the world who do not give up on the ones who were harmed. Who keep asking the question until they find the answer. Who turn numbers back into names. If you're still awake after that, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. Which case should we cover next?